Support for Designed By comes from generous donations from listeners just like you. Visit designedbyus.org/donate.
Scanning all frequencies. Hello.
Sound is a puzzle. You know, if I change the output volume of a speaker in the sound system, that will have a ripple effect on other things. If I change, you know, the level of the guitar overall through the show, I mean, that has a ripple effect to but so it's just like, you move one part, and you know, Nevin likes to say, and I like his analogy about this, it's like sifting for gold. Sometimes you solve one thing and that reveals something else.
Welcome to Designed By. I'm your host, Joanna Peña-Bickley. I've always believed that great design is a journey of learning, making intelligence visible. In every episode, I invite you to meet the trailblazers and changemakers, hearing their powerful stories of how they've not just imagined, but intentionally forged paths to a brighter future. Tune in to the inspiring stories that will energize you to intentionally dare to design a better future today.
Design the future.
Today is an absolute treat as we welcome a true luminary in sound design to our Aurora 21 studios. Please give a warm welcome to the incredibly talented Jessica Paz. Jessica is a Tony Award-winning sound designer, renowned for her extraordinary contributions to theater, film, and music. And as a theater buff and a film enthusiast, I am beyond excited about talking with Jessica today as we unravel her fascinating journey and go beyond and behind the scenes. So without further ado, let's welcome Jessica. Jessica, welcome to the show.
Hey, how are you? Happy to be here.
I'm good. You know, I've always believed that everybody has a story and everybody's story matters. So let's dive into yours. Where does your story begin?
So I grew up in Brooklyn. I had no indication that I wanted to work in theater. When I graduated high school, I went to John Jay College of Criminal Justice to study forensic psychology. I, within about a year and a half, decided that that wasn't for me and that I wanted to take a bit of a break. And I became the assistant manager of a scuba diving store and then eventually a bookkeeper. And then I was sort of the executive assistant for this accountant. And I realized she was charging more money for my time than I was being paid per hour, which totally makes sense. And that's how it works. But I then figured, well, I can, you know, sort of freelance bookkeeping and so I did, and I made $10 more an hour. So I had like a little in my, you know, I was like 19, 20 years old, and I had like 3 different clients, a cosmetic surgeon, a marketing company, and a cleaning service. And basically ended up, instead of working 40 hours a week, I was working, you know, half of that, and making the same amount of money. So that was really what sort of opened up my time in order to pursue theater. But rewinding a little bit from that, I fell into theater by accident, truly. You know, in high school, they would take us on these field trips to see shows. And I specifically remember seeing Bring in the Noise, Bring in the Funk. And, you know, about a week ago, actually, I was doing some cleaning in my house and I found all these old playbills from shows that I've seen when I was in high school. But it never occurred to me when I was watching these performances that there was like an entire army of people behind the scenes making it happen, right? Which is a testament to the magic of live theater, right?
Right.
Because there's, I read this book once called A Sense of Direction by William Ball, and he opens the book by saying that both the performers and the audience, when they enter a theater to perform or watch a show, all agree to suspension of disbelief, right? Mm-hmm. and they all agree to play pretend for the 2.5 hours that they're there. And yeah, and I guess it just never occurred to me like what magic was really happening. And I remember I had a friend who would perform as an ensemble member in the Rocky Horror Show at this community theater in Long Island on Saturdays. And I would go every Saturday, get dressed up. I'd know all the shoutbacks, and like she also played Eddie Dr. Scott, and it was really fun. And I was 19 or 20, and spending money on a ticket every weekend was not something I wanted to do. So I figured, well, if I'm here, why not volunteer? And so I would get to sit in the audience and watch the show until the very end, when Riff Raff comes out on the rocket, and I would run the fog machine from backstage. That was the very first thing I did in theater. And from there, I began sort of stage managing, like assistant stage managing. I also ran automation. Why they had me run automation, which is lowering Rocky from the ceiling, and it was not a motor. It was actually a hand crank, and there was no way that I could drop him because it would lock.
Right.
But I'm not the strong. I'm like 5'4" and I weigh like 110 pounds. So, and I'm like lowering an 180-pound guy from the ceiling. I don't know why they thought that was a good idea, but I didn't. He never got hurt. So I started stage managing, and eventually, that led to working on a show called Bat Boy the Musical. And one of the people who was in the show in New York actually was playing Bat Boy, and the sound was particularly terrible. I don't know why. I'm not sure who did the design. I don't know that they had a designer. I think that they just, it was a small theater that it's very low budget. And, we'd had feedback all the time. And so I remember asking a friend, I was like, how do you do a mic check?
That's awesome.
How do you do a mic check? I need to do a mic check. So he's like, well, you do, you turn it on, you turn these knobs, and then you find the feedback, and then you get rid of it. And I was like, okay, cool. So I go in before the next show and I do a mic check, and we finally had a show without feedback. And I was running lights, and the lighting designer, oddly, was running the sound. And so then I decided to switch us. And so I started mixing the show, and I just had a great time. And every day I would, move knobs around and make it sound better. And like, I had no idea what I was really doing, but it sounded better. So I was pretty happy with that. And a friend of mine, on the following show that I did, which I stage managed, which was South Pacific, I expressed some interest in continuing to do sound. And she knew someone at another theater in Long Island who wanted a sub, so that she could take time off, and she didn't have a sub at the moment. So I started working there, and I think I made like $50 a show or something ridiculous. And I eventually took over mixing because Jen, who was the sound person at the time, sort of moved on into the carpentry department and started working on scenic designs. So, and the short story is eventually there was this production of Smokey Joe's Cafe, which was being directed by my super dear friend, Ellen Dumlau, who I'm still friends with to this day. And I was super excited about it. And I went to my artistic director, Noel Ruiz, and I said that I wanted to design the show. And he said, oh, really? I said, yes. He's like, okay. He's like, he didn't say yes right away. And so I told him that if after 2 days of tech, he wasn't happy with my work, he could fire me. And then he didn't fire me. So from then on, I was the resident sound designer and engineer at that theater for about 1.5 years. And I then answered an ad on this mailing list for a sound operator on a play for Labyrinth Theater Company. And I remember interviewing with the sound designer, and he asked me if I knew this particular piece of software. And he knows that I fibbed, and I was like, oh yeah, I know that. But what I did was I went into.
You immediately go out and buy the book or something to like.
Oh, well, I mean, there really wasn't a book on it, but I looked it up, and then I made sure to because he was in rehearsals prior to tech, doing some programming and working on the sound design with the director and with the actors. And so I just went into the room and watched him program. And so I was familiar enough with the software by the time we got to tech. And I operated that show, and he then asked me to be his assistant on his next production. And he and I ended up working together for about 8 years on, a long list of shows that were all wonderful. And that culminated eventually into a production of a show called Fela. And for its sort of workshop, I was the engineer and the production audio person who was responsible for installing the sound system, etc. And I was in the room every day. And we thought we were going to move to Broadway after that workshop, but it didn't turn out to be that way. So the following year, we did a second workshop that culminated in an official off-Broadway run for a few weeks. So I was his assistant on that. And then we found out that the show was going to move to Broadway, and it was a beautiful moment, actually, because I was sitting in the hospital holding his brand new baby. Mm-hmm. His wife had just given birth that afternoon, and I went to the hospital to meet the baby. And while I'm holding his baby, he told me that the show was going to move to Broadway and that he wanted me to be his associate. And the show happened to open on Broadway, and at midnight, it became my 29th birthday, which was pretty great, at the opening night party, which was super fun.
That's remarkable.
Yeah, I was kind of...
How did you contain yourself? Like, just, you from going from a community or public theater onto, the biggest stage in the world.
I tell this story to everybody. I cried every day I cried my way home, and I cried my way to the theater every day. For no other reason than it's just really hard. It's just really hard work. It's really hard work. The hours are long. And I think there was at one point going from tech through the first week of previews, the way that the week falls, like when the union week starts, like the pay week starts and ends, allowed us somehow to work 13 days in a row. Mm. And, honestly, just, I think I cried my way home and into work every day just because of sheer exhaustion. And it's, it's not just physical exhaustion, it's mental exhaustion. But we did it, and we opened the show, and we worked on it. There were multiple productions of it. Beyond that, we took it to the National Theatre in London. I got to take it to Nigeria, which was fantastic. I got to mix a concert version of the show in Fela's actual nightclub, The Shrine, which was a completely out of body experience. And there were a number of tours, etc. So I continued to work on that for, 5 years. And eventually I sort of moved into, doing a lot of music mixing in bars and clubs and at Sleep No More. That was Sleep No More was great because, well,
let's just start it. Like, it was, when it first came out, it was probably one of the most novel things that I'd ever experienced. It was like Alfred Hitchcock's Marnie, meets something operatic.
I mean, I believe that it's the first of its kind in terms of immersive theater. Like, it created immersive theater. Yeah. I saw the show twice while I worked there. And even though I knew where to be at certain moments, somehow, no matter who I followed, I always ended up back in the dining room at the feast. I'm like, how is this possible? I work here. I know where I'm going. But I mixed sound in I wasn't the main engineer. I just, sort of worked a few days a week, but the great part was, there's this jazz band, the house band. If you've seen the show, where you enter, it's a bar. There's no band there when you enter for the show. And then when you come back at the end, there's a jazz band playing. When the jazz band is done, then other bands play. So I got to meet some of the greatest musicians in New York. And some of them are still friends of mine, and I go see them play. And one of the things I always say about like, how do you become a good sound designer? And I truly think that so much of my skill comes from not just working with Rob, which was, he's a wonderful mentor, and that was like the theater side of it, but working at Sleep No More, which is a nightclub environment, and I have like a box of Shure SM57s and maybe one kick drum mic, and I have to make the show sound good. There are no choices. It's just like that mic goes on the trumpet, it goes on the saxophone, it goes on the, guitar amp. It's just, you got one mic and you got to make that sound good on everything. And that really just taught me how to work quickly, and taught me, I think, that having the same microphone, which has its own sort of imprint, right? Its own sort of tonal response, right? And having to use that on everything, I think really, as I'm thinking about it, made me able to understand how certain instruments were voiced, because there was no coloring of anything by some other fancy microphone. It's the same microphone on everything. And so I got to really dive into like, oh, this is what a baritone wants to sound like. This is what a tenor wants to sound like. This is what a guitar amp wants to sound like. This is what a voice wants to sound like. And I think that there was no masking. I just got to really dig into the instrument. So I worked there. I worked at Queen of the Night for a while. I worked at a nightclub called The Box for a little bit, mixing bands there. I did a lot of events at Sleep No More. That was another thing that was really great. So they'd have these events and there'd be, 4 different locations throughout the building where bands would play. And there'd be like 4 different parties, but it was all one party throughout the entire 5 floors of the building. And I happened to be there also when they opened up their rooftop restaurant, Gallo Green. So I got to mix bands up there. And then they opened up the restaurant just below that called The Heath, and I got to mix. And then they had a house band up there on Friday nights. So I was just like, I was there all the time. I was practically there every day mixing. And one of the highlights of that actually was the Preservation Hall Jazz Band did a residency for 5 days, and I got to mix them.
Oh, wow.
And, yeah. And they ended their set every night with When the Saints Go Marching In, which, funny enough, my grandfather used to sing to me when I was a baby to put me to sleep.
Oh.
I don't know why that, and he would shake me almost violently, that would make me stop crying and fall asleep. So it was a real treat. So I did music for a while, and then I started just sort of taking sound calls, and mind you, there was also, in between all of this, I was doing the sound design for the entirety of the Lynbrook School District. So 3 elementary schools, 2 middle schools, and 2 productions at the high school per year. And I was also doing like various sound calls and hauling cable across football fields and pushing boxes and, doing, just like crazy
anything you could
calls
design.
Like anything that I could get my hands on, basically. Like, it wasn't even designing. It was just like anything I could get my hands on, I wanted to do, which, I also think was really advantageous for my design career, because I know what goes into unloading a truck, and I know what it takes to be an A2 backstage and run mics. And I know what it is to, have to change over a band 4 times in a night. Like at the Knitting Factory, I had 4 bands. All I had were stage plots, and I had to make an input list, and I had to go backstage and I had to repatch things. And I just had to remember, like nothing was labeled. There was no time to label anything. You have 20 minutes to change over the band, and you have to know, okay, the drums stay the drums. And then what was the saxophone now becomes the trumpet, and what was this becomes that. And, you just gotta roll with it. And then you're lucky if you get a sound check. Sometimes people don't even show up for their sound checks. I've had vocalists just not show up.
Oh, wow.
Oh, yeah. And I have an interesting story to circle back around the idea of yes and improv that has to do with Hadestown on Broadway. But we'll
get
circle
there.
back around to that. So a fun story was, while I was working at Queen of the Night, I was subbing for the main engineer, and I happened to get asked to sub on the New Year's Eve performance of the show. And afterward, there would be this, they threw parties all the time. And so there was this band that would play starting at 11 o'clock. And so what we had to do was, in the day, we set up the band on stage. They came in, they did a sound check. Then we had to turn it back over into the show. And as a matter of fact, I wasn't doing the show that night because I was doing 2 different New Year's events. I was mixing one of them, and I hired an engineer because I was designing the other one. So I left to go to the other venue, which happened to be around the corner at the Copacabana, and deal with that. And then the engineer who was doing Queen of the Night, the actual show that night, about a half an hour after I leave, calls me and says, so if I restored the console from the USB stick that I have the show saved on, does that erase the scene that we created for the band that goes on tonight?
Take it.
And I was like, yeah, it does. So essentially, when he came in to sub on the show, because he wanted to be super sure that he was using the right file and the right, he would load it from the USB stick, which just erases the whole desk. And, I had a snapshot in the desk that was like way past the show somewhere that was, with monitor wedge mixes, like EQs. It was like a 6-piece band. So I call my production manager and I'm like, so there's this thing. And I wouldn't say I have like a perfect photographic memory, but I have a pretty good photographic memory. Like if I walk into one of my shows and I look at an EQ for an actor, I can tell you whether it's correct or not. Mm-hmm. For the most part. Or if that's like where I left it, right? I know the level, like the output levels of certain channels of my processor on my Broadway shows and my tours. Like I could tell you, I could at least get very close. Mm-hmm. So I have to go in, and instead of me being able to help my counterpart change over from the show to the band, which we only have about 30 minutes to do, I have to sit in front of the desk and try to remember everything that I did during sound check. And of course, the band has no idea. The band has no clue. And my production manager's standing next to me and she's like, are you okay? Is it going to be okay? Are you okay? And I was like, we're going to find out. I'm going to turn it on. And, if they're either going to tell me that it sounds fine or it doesn't, and I'll hear the house and I'll make adjustments. But my biggest concern was like, am I just going to totally throw off the band if their monitor mixes aren't correct? Mm-hmm. And, we get to the show and I'm like, all right, hold on to your butts. And I just opened up the faders and everything was fine. It was fine. But that was absolutely nerve-wracking. It was completely nerve-wracking. I've never had to just like, all right, I think I did this. Here we go.
Did you know being a Latina woman in the corporate world gives you a leg up? Find out why on A La Latina podcast, the playbook to succeed being your authentic self, with Cynthia Kleinbaum-Milner and Claudia Romo Edelman. Listen to the podcast A La Latina, now on your favorite podcast platform.
Are you passionate about closing the gender gap in the world of technology and design? Introducing designedbyus.org, a game changer in the fight for equality. Did you know the percentage of women in tech roles today is lower than it was in the 80s? It's shocking, but true. Only 26% compared to the 35% back in 1984. Design by Us is on a mission to close the gender gap in tech and design. And they need your help. Their action learning apprenticeships empowers young, diverse students to pursue careers in technology and design. By making a donation to designedbyus.org, you can be a part of this vital change. Your contributions will support apprenticeship, boot camp, and resources for aspiring women in these fields. Together, we can level the playing field and give young, diverse people the support they need to learn, work, and constantly grow. Don't wait. Visit designedbyus.org/donate and make a difference. Designed by Us, closing the gender gap in tech and design.
Welcome back.
That's one of the things I think I kind of pick up is that you have a sense of resilience, and it is, and I think you've got to kind of have that, as a creator.
Sure.
I think there is a sense of the meticulous, to your point, around having, the photographic memory and being able to go back. But in a moment of stress, sometimes, I don't know about you, but at the most stressful, I have had those moments of photographic memory. Oh, recall not happening.
Right. Sure. I mean, I think that I certainly go through, I like to say that I go through postmortem at the end of every project. And I certainly have breakdown, in a way. I'll sleep for 3 days to a week after a project is done, or after a series of projects are done. Sometimes I move from one to the next, to the next, to the next. But it's like a postpartum, it's like giving birth to a child.
Yeah.
So, and then all of a sudden, it's this super intense 16 hours a day, high stakes. And then it's like being dropped off a cliff because it's open and it's done and it's over. What?
Yeah.
It's just it's just getting pushed out of an airplane and you're like, all right.
Well, give our listeners a little bit. I think that I'd love to dive a little bit behind the scenes. Give us a day in the life of, what going through tech is like, and then opening night. I think that
day in the life. I was going to ask you which day. It's
we might take a couple
day.
days. Yeah. Let's maybe pick up some of the hardest ones.
Well, I'll summarize sort of the pre-production process. There's interesting things to talk about where that's concerned, but essentially for a Broadway show, all we get is 4 walls and some seats and a stage. There's no cable, there's no speakers, there's no lights, there's nothing. And there aren't even sometimes systems in the dressing rooms. And so I and my team spec every single piece of sound equipment that goes into a production. Speakers, amplifiers, microphones, every adapter, it's, you name it. Paging systems. We also handle intercom and all of the closed caption television, that the team uses backstage stage management uses to call the show, and everybody watches, has monitors to see what's going on stage. And so we also take care of all of that. So I get hired for a show, and what happens is we go to a site visit. I look at the space in 3D, and then in a 2D medium for drafting, I turn that into prediction. I take it into prediction software, and then I look at speaker systems and spec what it is I want. And then we draft that on the 2D medium, and then we share that with other departments. And then, lighting and I'll figure out, okay, well, can you put the speaker here? Can you go 1 foot over there? Can you take that light out of center? I need to put a speaker there. We do all of that. And, then I create a flow. There's a workbook that has about, 30 different Excel sheets in it that specify inputs, outputs, amplifier channels, processing channels, network configuration, intercom configuration, video configuration. There's pivot tables that tally things. It's a very involved document that evolves over time, but that that input output flow gets created. And that's how I then make a list that gets sent to the shops for bid. They come back with pricing. They also come back with, we have this, but not that. We have this speaker, but not that speaker. And, you know, can you deal with this substitution? If not, then they have to buy that equipment because I want it. Right. So, and then it's a matter of like choosing and engineering where you want to make the exceptions and say, okay, well, yes, I can use that thing that you have in stock to replace this thing that I asked for, but I can't do it for this item. Like I can't do that for the console because I need that for being able to mix the show and design it the way that I want and to get the result that I'm looking for. So that happens. And then we go into, go through that process. The producing company, general managers will agree with the shop on pricing for a per weekly rental cost. And then my team, so my engineer, A1, who mixes the show, A2, who works backstage and does all the RF work and works with the actors and their microphones, the production audio person who oversees the installation, my associate, and a number of other people who come in to help build the show from scratch. Like all of that equipment comes in, it gets built custom for every show. We put it together, we test it, and then we take it apart, and we don't take it all the way apart, but we like, you know, because we don't take everything out of the racks. But it's sort of like, what's that show with the motorcycles?
I'm not sure.
Like they build the motorcycles custom, and then they have to take them apart because they have to send all the parts out for to be painted, and then it comes back, and then it gets put back together. I forget them. It's like the name is escaping me. So it gets taken apart, put on a truck, sent to the theater, and then it gets installed in the theater. And then we start tech. We tune the system. So I go in, I make a bunch of pink noise. It's awful sounding. And then I, calibrate the speaker system and then we start tech.
It sounds like what's interesting to me is that as you're going through it, it really sounds like you are a conductor of an orchestra of everything from the equipment to the people. And then there's the sound, which is the thing that everybody is producing.
Oh, we haven't even gotten to that part yet.
Yeah,
like, all of that's happened and we haven't even gotten to sound. A fun thing that Nevin, my partner on Hadestown, I learned from him, and he likes to say is, the first day of tech, sound comes out, no one gets hurt. Like that's the only goal for the first session of tech. Sound came out, no one got hurt. So yeah, and tech is intense in many ways. It's intense because sometimes you're sitting around and waiting. It can be completely frustrating. I've had a show where we had so much automation on this show that I think we actually turned on microphones for like an entire 25 minutes total across a 16-hour day. So, sometimes it's like a lot of waiting, and I work on other things. I work on, just preliminary EQs for the band before I get them. We're working on setting up the band wherever it is they're located, in the pit, on stage, on a band platform, etc. In sometimes a dressing room. Sometimes drums will be in a dressing room on the 4th floor, or in the tower. We work on sound effects or any sound cues. Sometimes we're helping to facilitate show control, so like time code that will trigger lighting or projections. So there's stuff to do, and of course all of the utility microphones that the director and the choreographer speak over, like that's coming through our sound system. Intercom is our responsibility, video is our responsibility. Not video that is part of the show, but the backstage video is our, yeah. So there's lots going on. And during that time, prior to getting the band, we just have like a rehearsal piano, sometimes rehearsal drums that are just in the house. And I focus really on the vocal system, the sound system and how the vocals come through the sound system. And I work very hard on getting that to sound as good as possible before we get the band in earnest, right? So then we'll do, Usually it's 2 band calls. So 9 a.m. to noon prior to 2 4 or 5 hour tech sessions. So it's like an 8 a.m. to 11 p.m. day.
Mm-hmm.
And the first day is seating, but by then we've pretty much line checked everything already on our own. So we seat the band, we make them comfortable, but all of their stuff is functional and all their monitoring is already functional. And so seating generally turns into like a line check with the actual players and then them checking their in-ear monitors and their little personal mixers and making sure that they have what they need, utility wise. And then I'll usually end that session, more often than not, like 99% of the time that seating session ends with being able to play through a song. And then the second session, the next day, is playing through the show from top to bottom.
Mm-hmm.
And I just listen to the band, and that's really about, I'm not doing too many sort of level changes of individual inputs per song. What I'm really doing in that session is making sure that we have something cohesive top to bottom for the show. Like, does the guitar sound good all of the time?
Mm-hmm.
Like, yes, we have to bring out little accents here and there, etc. That's programming that we'll take care of as we now move through the tech process with the band and band sessions and through notes. But it's really about getting the band to sound good as a whole. And then there's the very, it always ends up going fine, but it's always very stressful the first day that you put cast and band together for the first time.
Mm.
There's usually something called a sits probe where we go into a rehearsal studio and the actors get to sing through the show with the full band and everyone gets to hear the orchestrations. On Hadestown, we don't do sits probes, we do Vondel probes. And so it's just, and we did that on Beautiful Noise as well. It's just, we just get on stage and the first time cast and band is together is everyone singing through the show in microphone and with sound. And I get to hang out on stage and make sure monitoring systems and are sufficient for the actors to hear what they need to hear in terms of band information and that they're getting what they want. And then in certain circumstances, on shows in which the actors are wearing boom microphones, headset mics,
Mm-hmm.
there may very well be vocals in the onstage monitors as well.
Got it.
So I get to have a lot of time to work on that during the Vondel probe. So it's the first time we put the cast and band together, I'm usually on stage with my iPad that can control the console and a laptop that can control the sound system and just making sure that, everyone's feeling comfortable. And of course, everyone has the ability to stop that rehearsal should they not be able to hear something. And, I'm there to help. So, and that gives me, a good idea of like, oh, okay, well, you know what? The band is not drowning out the vocals. It's actually fitting together pretty well. And like,
Mm-hmm.
it gives me an idea of what work is ahead of us, and then we have run throughs, and we just keep every day, every day the focus gets smaller and smaller. Like it starts as the big picture and then, and then you just like dial in and you focus in. And I like to say that it's like this, it's, sound is a puzzle.
Mm-hmm.
If I change the output volume of a speaker in the sound system, that will have a ripple effect on other things. If I change, the level of the guitar overall through the show, that has a ripple effect but so it's just like, you move one part and, Nevin likes to say, and I like his analogy about this, it's like sifting for gold. Sometimes you solve one thing and that reveals something else. Right. So, it's sort of like a spiral. You sort of circle around it and the circle gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller until one day it just goes ding.
Yeah.
It just all slots together. And that also has to do with, the A1 learning the show. They're mixing the show line by line. So if there's 2 people on stage having a conversation, only one person's microphone is open at a time.
Oh, wow.
For every single line that they speak. There's a really interesting video that was done where you can witness a friend of mine, Kevin McCoy, mix some of Hamilton, actually. And I forget what show it was on. There's a video on YouTube. And
oh my gosh, at the rate and pace that they are going, and it's like they're calling back. There's no pause.
Oh yeah, no, I've
like, oh my gosh.
I've attempted to learn the show.
Yeah.
And I was actually training to become a sub on it, which ended up not panning out because I ended up on some other projects, and so I couldn't stay committed to it. But a friend of mine was like, "Hey, good luck with the Reynolds pamphlet," which is like the really fast rap number in Act 2. You're never going to be president. It's so unbelievably fast. It's so fast. It really. I will say though, it being fast is fine because once you learn it, because that entire show and Hadestown similarly is all to music.
Right.
It all has to like slot into a rhythm. And so for me, actually mixing dialogue scenes is harder because they don't necessarily follow the actors don't necessarily follow the same rhythm in those scenes because they have a little bit more freedom. They don't have to be on a beat, right? So, but I mean, I haven't mixed anything in about 5 years. So
let's talk about this remarkable journey. Like you go from like, it sounds like you go from like kind of stumbling into it, during high school while you're juggling lots of other things. You come into this space. And one of the things that I have loved about this is that you seem to have a voracious desire to learn. Right. Because it seems like you didn't have formal training coming into the space. It was like, I'm going to learn this thing. We're going to figure it out. And then I'm going to make an art of it. And it seems like you're having a ton of fun. So you get to this point where you've started to build a network. You've got that. And then Tonys, like, I hit the Tonys. You go, okay, along those ways, you've won tons of awards. You've had a tremendous amount of recognition, but then you get a show like Hadestown that, for our listeners out there, and I'd love for you to kind of take us through it. But, for me, I think we all know Hamilton, but Hadestown is actually something so remarkable in the story that it tells. But it is like the music is so stirring, and the blend between effects and music, and it all culminates and creates a part of the story. If you turned off the sound, you'd miss so much of the emotion, the human emotion in every scene. And so tell us a little bit about, one, how do you land a show like that? And then two, because that in itself, right, is, I think, an important part of the journey. But I think two is, how do you go from when you were talking a little bit about, every day of that first interaction of when you get to Broadway, crying, to finding the joy and getting really excited about doing something this big?
Oh gosh, yeah. I mean, there was a lot of joy, and there was also, the absolute just sheer knowledge of, oh my gosh, I'm actually designing a Broadway show. But just to rewind a little bit, I landed a show like Hadestown because of Nevin. He hired me as his associate to do the Canada production, and he had limited availability. He offered me up as an associate who could go in his stead, and he would come visit. And I went to Canada, worked on the show. And then a year later, approximately a year, they were going to do a production of the show, another out of town. Like, I think the idea was to move the show to Broadway after Canada, but they decided to do another out of town. And we did it in London at the National, which is just like one of the most amazing facilities to work at. I just love that place. And I remember I had stopped into a rehearsal one day to like watch a run through, and my producer was there, and she's like, "Can I talk to you for a minute in the other room?" And I was like, "What?" Oh God. Okay. Sure. And, she said that they wanted to make me co-designer of the show. And I was like, does Nevin know about that? Like, she's like, oh yeah, no, he was part of the conversation. And So I called him and he's like, are you okay with that? And I was like, yeah, I'm okay with that. So I went to London to do the show there, and he came out to visit, and then we were actually together the whole time on Broadway, which was great. And, I learned so much from him. And it was so wonderful to have a friend and a colleague and a mentor that I admire and love working with be there for my first design. It felt like such a wonderful support system. And I remember, I'm not certain that I think at this point I've told him this story, but right before we went to Broadway, I read Tina Fey's book, Bossy Pants.
I love that book.
It's so good. It's
so
great.
good. Yeah.
It's so good. But there was one part that really stood out to me because I, of course, was, Nevin was around for part of Canada and London, but not through the whole process each time. And I was having a little bit of stress about how do I do this with him the whole time. And the reason I was stressed is because I believe that, at least for me and in my story, in my life, that equality is not just about people treating me as their equal, but about feeling like I am their equal.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Because, and I think that they're two very separate things.
Yeah.
And they also play into each other. Right? Because he could treat me like his equal all day long. If I don't feel that way in myself, in my own body, in my own spirit, in my own work, then how he treats me isn't going to land. I mean, he always treats me as an equal. That's
totally
1,000%. But I went into it going like, okay, I have to believe that. I have to show up feeling like his equal. And when I'm having a conversation with him artistically about a moment in the show, I need to not feel intimidated. Mm-hmm. And not only is he my mentor, but, for the last 5 years, the relationship we had was me as his associate, not as his co-designer.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And as an associate, there's just I may have an opinion about something and I might share that with him, but ultimately it's not up to me. Right. I might have an idea. But as a co-designer, I can have an idea and I can also be like, no, I really think this is how it ought to be. And in Tina Fey's book, there is, and it's actually in a gray box, and she describes improv. And I read that portion. I actually took a photo of it. So I carried it around with me everywhere. And it's about improv being about yes and, improv doesn't work if someone says that they're a pickle and the other person doesn't believe that they're a pickle. They can't respond in an improvisational way. And I just thought that was such a great piece of advice to take with me into that room and approach working with him in a yes and way, in which if he questioned me or he had an idea, I would say yes. And also, what if we did? Yes. And also, yes. And the reason it was born that way, or the reason that it is designed that way, is because here are the steps that we took in Canada and London that landed us into this place. But what is it that you think? And, oh yeah, that's a great idea. Let's do that. And then we'd have really good fun on stage, because it'd be like, oh my God, this monitor sounds terrible. We'd be walking around he's like, well, why'd you make it that way? Why'd you do that? Or something would happen and be like, I don't know, go talk to the sound designer. So we'd have a lot of fun, which was good. But that book and that particular excerpt about improv has just been something I've carried with me since that moment, since I've read it.
Where do you find your confidence? I mean, where does it come from? Because you have it's contagious. It really is.
That's really interesting that you say that. And I people laugh at me when I say that I'm shy, actually. They're like, you are not shy. You are not subtle. You are not shy.
I have never met a New York kid, like somebody who grew up in New York who's actually shy.
Yeah.
How does that work?
It's taken a lot of work, to be honest. I was very shy as a child. And I was not popular in elementary school. I was a nerd, and I was,
as the greats are usually.
Yes, I was super tiny. I'm still only like 115 pounds soaking wet, and I'm 5'3.5". I'm a small person. I don't act like I'm small. Like it doesn't occur to me that I'm little. It's like those little tiny dogs that think that they're like huge Dobermans or something. It's like, that's how it doesn't occur to me how tiny I actually am. I would just say that it's always been a work in progress. And, I have a lot of days where I 100% have complete imposter syndrome. I don't know anyone personally who doesn't ever have that. I think that it's,
how do you quiet that? Yeah. How do you quiet that bitch down? Because I had a girlfriend who said to me once upon a time, I was having terrible imposter syndrome. I had just landed a new role. It was this thing, and we were doing something, and I was feeling completely out of my comfort zone, which meant I was growing. But I remember, like, she could see it in my face, and she said, "You need to shut that bitch up. You got into this room because of this, and this. Shut her up."
I say that I cope with it in the sense that when it comes down to having to get it done, I just get it done. There is no other option. It just needs to get done. Right. It needs to get done. It needs to get done well. We're working at the highest level that we're working. I am 100% a perfectionist. And I will never actually achieve perfection. And
but you know that
voice.
Yeah, but you know that, right? That there's a part of you that says you can strive for perfection, and that's what makes you great.
Oh, because there will always be a note. There will always be a note.
Of course.
I will never mix a perfect show. I will never, there will always be some little thing that probably the audience doesn't even notice. But I know it. I know that was like ever so slightly a millisecond too late or what have you. But yeah, when it comes down to it, there's no room for that voice in my head when it's like go time. It'll usually come into my brain at night or my day off. And I mean, there's just no choice.
In a live situation, you're absolutely right. No, it feels like you've got to go with what your instinct is. And if you're good at your craft, then your instincts are probably right.
A lot of the time. Sometimes they're wrong, but they're wrong because you try it and then you're like, oh, that's not right.
Right.
And I think that it actually, part of the way that I quiet her is that I've learned to not be afraid to fail. That took a lot of work, and I still am working on that, and I will be working on that for the rest of my life. But I constantly remind myself that it is okay to make a mistake, because actually sometimes making a mistake might lead you to the right answer and the right idea. So that's how I quiet it, because we're human.
Listening to this episode with you, Rachel, our podcast sound designer, I'm always really curious as somebody who's in the area of this craft. What did you think?
Well, the two things that really stuck out to me is sound is like a puzzle. I really love that, because that is the truth of sound, especially when you're working in such a live setting, because the guitar, the people, the general orchestra do not sound the same, but yet they need to have equal measure when it comes to being sure everyone has the same focus on what's happening on stage. And, I enjoyed hearing, as awkward as that sound, I enjoyed hearing that I'm not the only one with imposter syndrome, and it allows Jessica to fight to the eventual path of growth.
I think she was so candid about that. I think the fact that she talked about, that her growth came with crying every single day, that feeling, that discomfort actually meant that she was growing, and she was growing in a path that wasn't easy.
Exactly. And it's also just the humility of understanding that while you do have all these awards and accolades, you need to be humble enough to be able to understand failure in the sense of a learning opportunity and not a step back in your career.
Totally. And I think Jessica Paz is a great example of how that humility comes to life. It makes her so real, so approachable. And I really think the world of Jessica and her work.
No, and I'm very excited because when we go to the premium content, you'll hear a lot more about that. Want to read us out?
This episode was written and produced by the Design Corps at Aurora 21 in the heart of New York's magical Hudson Valley. Special thanks to the musical talents of Rachel Bickley, our podcast sound designer. Our theme music was composed by Substance Studios. If you're already following the show, you are well on your way to designing a better future today. If not, what in the heck are you waiting for? It's time to join our community and feel the magic. Go to your favorite podcast service and search Designed By with Joanna Peña-Bickley and hit follow.
Design the future.
Substance Studios.